Saying that women created feminism is like saying that pigs created the bacon industry. Feminism is not beneficial to women, it's a weapon used against women. The foundations of feminism are not built on years of oppression and abuse and the determination of women to be free. They're built on a gigantic fraud.
The battle of the sexes. In this timeless struggle for supremacy between man and woman,
feminism is a device to manipulate women, and is not primarily concerned with men except to use men as a tool, as someone to blame, as the other, the equivalent of a big bad bogeyman. Women like to think that feminism was started by brave, inspirational women marching through the streets. But feminism didn't begin there, it began here. And although it might appear that feminism started in the 1960s, as we'll see, feminism actually started 20 years before this. What was happening in the 1960s was not the start of feminism, but rather the start of a version of feminism that was solely concerned with abusing men. The originators of this male hatred, this misandry, were able to leverage the power of feminism for what is effectively a parallel campaign of hatred against men. This male hatred, sometimes called radical feminism, has become wrapped up in the original form of feminism and is now indistinguishable from it.
The women originally behind this type of feminism were mostly lesbians who simply hated men.
They were burning their bras and doing all sorts of silly things, making fools of themselves, and they were a joke.
Very, very strong feminists. I've always considered myself a feminist, but boy, they've got me beat all hollow. They are feminists on the extreme, i.e., let's just do away with men and have sperm banks. It was that sort of thing.
The radical feminist movement didn't believe in any deodorants. I mean, it was just very fascist. Any deodorants, any makeup, any clothes. I mean, everybody wore boiler suits and mouse suits and looked dank and depressing.
Well, the women's movement is led by women who aren't really, I would say they're dysfunctional women, the leaders of the women's movement. If you look at their histories, if you look at their backgrounds, there is significant evidence of failed relationships, of promiscuous behaviour, of lack of concern for others, and or of some other troublesome period in their history. I don't think they're normal women. And many of them are lesbian, which when this is pointed out, many people often think, well, there's nothing wrong with being lesbian, and I'm not suggesting 1 minute that there is, but if you look at the lesbian women who are involved in the women's movement, you will see that they're a very particular kind of lesbian, and they tend to be the butch, men-hating type.
Indeed, some feminists simply want to do away with men.
Regarding the feminist movement, what does the slogan, "make the personal political," mean?
To me, that I always hated that slogan. What it really means is you take your personal damage. And one of the things was very obvious in those very early days of the women's movement, how many of the radical women leaders of the movement themselves had really disturbed backgrounds and were very, very violent. And then you make that political. So if my dad's a shit, all men are shits. If you say that, you can do almost anything you like. You could go from the personal and make it political. So what happened is a sufficient group of women got together to complain bitterly, because you have to remember the beginning of the feminist movement was a Marxist movement. It was women in the left of the politics in Britain who decided that they had had enough of working with men on the left and were going to have their own, in quotes, movement. So our feminist movement never grew from a grassroots of the working class women that they were always talking about. There weren't any working class women. It was actually academics, university lecturers, young women students was the beginning of the women's movement. Over the 12 years that I was running the refuge, if I went to speak, there was screaming feminists outside. I tried to publish a book called Prone to Violence. We finally did get it published, but I had to have a police escort all around England, and there were death threats and bomb threats. And the final moment came for me after struggling for all those years, when the bomb disposal unit came to my house. because there was a suspect package, and said everything that came to me had to go to them first because they were concerned about my safety and the safety of my family. And that's when I left England and went into exile for something like 15 years.
Later on, in an effort to be taken more seriously, these virulent women went underground and toned down their public message. But their feelings towards men remained the same.
The political problem at the time, which is something I've never been able to get out into the open, is that the feminist movement, having formed itself in late 1969-70, never got the kind of support it needed financially because it was so extreme.
But then finally they hit on the topic that gave them the credibility they so badly needed, and it also gave them the funding.
Well, major agenda for the feminist group is to make sure that they have the maximum amount of financial income from the victims of domestic violence.
Later on, and up to the present day, feminism has been adopted by most women as they've seen the advantages that they've been granted over men. Government has allowed these feminist women to spread their hatred against men for decades, when such abuse of any other group than men would have been against the law.
And outside, and this is in the press cuttings, there were huge demonstration with banners, and on the banners it said, "All men are bastards, all men are rapists." And I asked the police, I went down and said to the police, if that was black men or Jews, you'd arrest those women. But why don't you They just looked very uncomfortable. And one of them said, "We're frightened of them."
I've even received emails from women telling me that my website is illegal because it's an act of domestic violence against women. You cannot complain against women without them feeling that they have a right to abuse you, to threaten you, to intimidate you. And when it comes to the mainstream media, newspapers and whatever, they won't receive a few emails. They'll receive thousands of emails, thousands of letters orchestrated by the feminist lobby, which you must remember is extremely well funded. And so the women are goaded into believing that they are being abused by the male population.
Government has turned a blind eye to their activities because it helped to further its own ends by turning women against men.
Feminism as we know it was truly created during the Second World War.
Women were forced into the workplace by the demands of war in far greater numbers than ever before in history.
In the arms factories, men and women worked long hours to fill the gaps in British defences.
Men who were excluded from combat duties still carried the greater burden of production, but women had to take part as well.
Changed women's lives forever, with many of them learning new skills such as driving bombs or moving tiny replica arrows around giant walls, using only stepladders and their natural sense of
But at the end of the conflict, the surviving men came back from the front. Those that still had their limbs intact and who had managed to retain their sanity went straight back to work. Women gratefully left the factories and went back home.
Business and government didn't like this one little bit. They'd had their eyes open to the potential of women as workers alongside men and wanted them out of the home and back into the workplace. It was this desire, primarily motivated by greed, which started the quest to persuade women to work. Feminism was born. Feminism is about exploiting a new market, women.
A better word for feminism would be put women to workism. This far more accurately describes the true nature and purpose of feminism. But the difficulty faced by business and government in putting women to work is simple to understand. Why should they? Why would any privileged group shrug off the luxury of not needing to work and willingly take up jobs when there's no benefit to them doing so? It's equivalent to persuading the Queen to trade in Buckingham Palace for a job in the local laundrette by telling her that she's oppressed by not having a proper job. The fact is, no government could ever make women go to work against their will. She's got a man working for her, she's living quite comfortably, she's looking after her children, her husband and her home. What would she do with the kids if she was working? Why would she want to be apart from them? So instead of even attempting to force women into work, government and business use the pathologically selfish psychology of women to make women choose to go to work for themselves. This is not to say that women had easy lives before feminism, but what is true is that women's lives were more focused on the needs of their families, whereas now women are forced to be more focused on their 9-to-5 jobs.
The most difficult task, and what should have been impossible, was how could mothers be persuaded to abandon their own children to childcare whilst they went to work?
Today's announcement is also looking at pilot schemes across England to give 2-year-olds a place at nursery.
It would seem like an impossible task, but the establishment was fortunate enough to have two powerful weapons to use against us all: the selfishness of women and the stupidity of women.
I thought of several ways to describe the behaviour of women with regard to feminism, but I was forced to settle on stupid under the sheer weight of evidence. The true irony for women, so consumed with self-interest, is that feminism is not about setting women free. It's about enslaving them. Women would have been far better served by rejecting every notion of feminism. If they'd done so, they'd be leading lives of much greater freedom than they do today. Business, by using feminism, has managed to convince women to want, demand and fight for wage slavery. They persuaded women that freedom lies in their slavery, and they've even made women believe that they're independent by being dependent on the job. They persuaded the elite group of people who have not had to work to survive into throwing off their privilege and free time, their quality of life and the needs of their families, and trade it all in for the treadmill of work.
If you can look at all the family tax credit systems and that type of thing, and payments to encourage the childcare facilities and that sort of thing, then obviously that's the route that they're taking. And if it appeals to women, and women have been told and brainwashed over the years that you've got to go back out to work, and they have been brainwashed, and there's all these childcare facilities as well, then you end up with a society that's moving along that line of its own volition.
Government has used feminism to grow larger in power by attempting to act as a replacement for men and fathers. By splitting up men and women, and by deliberately failing to support family, government has ensured that women stop looking to men for support and reach out to government instead.
Amy, are you getting enough from the state?
I don't think I am, no.
What do you get at the moment? Just
Pardon?
What sort of help do you get?
I'll get housing benefit and income support.
Government policy of not supporting the family. One father, one mother under one roof with its biological children. That's no longer supported.
You have the radical feminists who are pushing to exclude men from the family. That's one of their avowed aims. We want men out of the family. Unfortunately, we are described as the enemy.
By drafting equality laws and lying about the treatment of women at work, government has enraged women and made them even more determined to regard men as the enemy, to compete against men, and to flood into the workforce.
To outlaw discrimination against you if you're black, if you're a woman. Men who work full-time still earn 40% more per hour than women who work part-time. We're going to tackle sexism in the city.
Female vote tends to be the moving vote. When you go back past previous elections, the male vote tends to stay fairly static. The female vote is the one that shifts. So if they can shift that female vote into their camp, and it means giving them whatever it is they need to give them to keep them there, then that's what they'll do. It's only politics.
But government's aim has never been to make women happier or improve their lives. Just as with business, its aim has always been to get more economic use out of women by removing them from their children and putting them to work. And this is sold to women as a positive thing for families, and women are stupid enough to swallow it and ask for more.
Maybe if they gave us a little bit more leeway with childcare and the whole area around childcare, then maybe we could go back and support ourselves.
That under Labour, breakfast and after-school clubs like this one would guarantee affordable childcare before and after school.
It is not about children being abandoned in schools for 10 hours a day all year round.
Parents can drop their children off 7 o'clock in the morning, don't have to pick them up till 6 o'clock in the evening. Tony Blair thinks this is a model for the rest of the country. He wants to introduce this in every primary school right across the country, and he says he can do it within 5 years.
Government doesn't even try to hide what they're doing, and they're brazen enough to tell everyone. But women still don't get it.
Fairness is important for our economy. An economy which sees no one pushed to the margins or excluded brings the widest pool of workers to employers, brings the widest pool of workers to employers, brings the widest pool of workers to employers.
Being a housewife or full-time mum or homemaker, however you want to describe it, is a great privilege that women have enjoyed, made possible by the work of men.
It's a badge of honour and success for a woman to be called a housewife. It's not an insult. Yet somehow, business and government have convinced women that not having a job is somehow demeaning.
Feminist ideology opposes families because they see family situation as families as situations wherein women are oppressed to stay at home to look after the children, whereas men get all the goodies trundling out to work. But in fact, I mean, the truth is very much the opposite, that historically the men have been the workhorses who have had to go out to work to support their families, and women saw themselves very much as privileged to be able to stay at home and to have a man look after them.
Most people on this planet aspire to a situation where they no longer need to work for a living. But somehow, women have been persuaded to give this up in favour of wage slavery. Feminism must be seen as possibly the most fantastically successful piece of PR ever conceived and executed. And that's not all that's been done. The female contraceptive pill introduced in the 1960s was the major enabler to force women into the workplace. Women like to believe that the pill was about sexual liberation for women. It wasn't. The pill allowed women to control their fertility so that they could enter the workforce without unpredictable pregnancy. In other words, the pill made women more useful to business and more employable. It made women more like men. The pill, combined with the female politics of the time, was the spark and fuel of feminism.
Never forget when I turned the corner at the Hotel Plaza, I could not see to the end. It was the most exciting day. It was the time that the women's movement became a movement.
The ideas and plans of business and government to properly exploit women by putting them to work truly came to fruition during this period. The key was to make women angry. Government and business found this very easy to do.
The campaign in the United States is another stage in a long fight. Since the start of the century, women have been battling attitudes that hold them back. Yet around the world, half the people still can't enjoy all the freedoms the other half take for granted.
Newspapers and television broadcasting in the 70s was dominated by feminist journalists. This enabled the hateful and biased views of feminism to become mainstream.
The most successful part of it is that at that point in the 70s, if you think about it, the majority of women who were journalists internationally were very heavy radical feminists. So they had the women's pages. And of course male journalists and male editors, seeing it as, in quotes, a woman's problem, left it to them. And very quickly there was a savage kind of censorship, and anybody who dared argue was in very serious trouble.
If you don't agree with us, you are against us. It's a politically correct game. It's intimidate. You cannot speak your mind because you are deemed to be offending people. And the only people you can offend with impunity are men, particularly white, heterosexual men. You've got everything of those, that everything is stacked against you.
They obviously put a great deal of effort into moving outside of the status of victims. But what they've got now is all the advantages and protection that comes with the status of victims when they're not actually victims anymore. And they would say themselves that they're not victims, and yet they claim all the powers of victims, so you can do no wrong.
Whenever men try to speak out, or articles are written that in some way oppose the feminist agenda, women's groups, women's lobby groups, will stir up in their gullible female supporters hysteria, and they will claim and they will argue that the attacks that are made on the feminist movement and on the female point of view create a climate of fear amongst the vulnerable females in the community, and therefore they should not be articulated at all.
The problem is that they still think of any comment from a man or any attempt of a man to gain power as being at the expense of women. So men are being hobbled in trying to gain power for themselves, because any man gaining power is gaining power at the expense of women, across the board.
So in other words, the very act of protesting against the feminist movement is deemed by them to be creating a climate of fear. So men must not speak in case those women who happen to be vulnerable out there hear you.
No man can help themselves, because when a man does that, they're taking it away from women.
Why was it female psychology that took over, if you like?
Well, firstly, they were in charge of publishing. They spend 70% of the money. They are therefore very important from the point of view, say, newspapers and the media in general with selling their wares. They will lobby companies and suggest that if they are supporting views which are inconsistent with the feminist movement, they are supporting abuse against women.
So what women do is they can be oppressive, and as we've seen with fathers' rights, they are being oppressive, but they will never even think of themselves being oppressive. They won't even imagine that they're being oppressive, because in their mind, in their world, they're victims, and they're still victims.
For the last goodness knows how many years, time and time again, one would read in the newspapers that the laws were somehow biased against women. Can you believe it? Lawyers, A, B, C down to Z, would write about how women were unfairly treated with regard to the alimony, their alimony in divorce, what have you. Baroness Kennedy, Helena Kennedy, people like that. They would proudly proclaim who they were and what their objectives were. 2 years ago, a barrister wrote in the Times an article which quite meekly pointed out that men were sometimes unfairly treated in the law. He didn't dare give his name. This was only 2 years ago. And so my point is that that's how much intimidation people feel about speaking out.
If I wanted to go and be a bus driver, I think I should have the right to apply, and if I can drive a bus, be able to drive it.
Women to this day do not seem to realise just how free they are compared with men. In 1970, 18-year-old men in America were being drafted for the Vietnam War. Women, suffering under overbearing oppression, were exempt.
We find this time and again with women's view of oppression in the past and up to the present day. They'll ignore the overwhelmingly more common and more severe examples of male oppression all around them, and focus only on their own troubles.
So this woman moans about her opportunities to drive a bus, but has no capacity to appreciate the real oppression of men being forced to fight and die.
In today's world, business sees even more money to be made from the stupidity of women. It's made them dissatisfied with their current level of slavery, and has made them demand more.
So we have the pay gap myth, bogus sexual harassment claims, and the glass ceiling myth. All these are created and hugely exaggerated to make women angry and feel like they aren't getting enough in the workplace.
We also need to hold on to equal pay. Women work for 76 cents on the dollar for the same work that men do. That's not right in America.
Elaine Day is suing for sex discrimination and unfair dismissal.
How did this happen? How have women fallen for such a blatant con trick?
You see, the first rule of the con
is you can't cheat an honest man.
it's never been done.
Can't happen.
Impossible. The only way this thing works is if you want something for nothing.
So what do? Well, we give you nothing for something. Feed the greed.
It's women's greed that has fueled feminism. The architects of feminism knew they could count on the stupidity and greed of women, their desire to have it all. Feminism promised women what they've always wanted. It promised them everything. It promised freedom and choice and happiness, but it's delivered none of it. But it was easy to see from the start that it could never deliver what women wanted. It could only deliver what business and government wanted. Women in the workplace, like men. Humanity needed strength and wisdom in women to fight off the siren song of feminism. It was up to women to see through the charade. It wasn't a fight that men could take on.
No one could force women to abandon the needs of family and go to work. Not government, not business, not anyone. It was up to women to reject feminism, or have it take over all of our lives.
Unfortunately, women chose not to fight it, but instead embraced it. Through feminism, women truly believed that they could have it all. Like children in a toy shop, they thought feminism was giving them all these new goodies, new rights, new powers, new freedoms, new opportunity, when in fact, all they were getting were chains.
How can it be possible for something that's not good for society to be pushed by radical feminists?
It all kicked off in the 70s with the Equal Opportunities Commission. What you had there was a commission set up which was designed, although it said it was equality for all, it was designed really to enable women to achieve equality. I had a person say to me, a solicitor said to me about 3 or 4 years ago that women can really organise themselves well, and I said no, they're not any more better organised than men. I said quite simply, when you've got a commission there which is set up for the benefit of women's equality, in inverted commas, whereby anything that a woman screams about, she can call upon a whole phalanx of lawyers from the EOC who will push their case, there's no great difficulty in achieving that. So what you've had from the 70s And as they used to see it in the newspapers, sort of year after year, another male bastion crumbles, and you get this silly headline news would come out that women had achieved this and had achieved that. Quite simply, you had a commission that was there exclusively at their use to push for whatever they wanted to achieve. And then, of course, you had politicians always hungry for a vote. And what better vote to have than a woman's vote if they can promise them a whole list of goodies. I mean, the Labour Party, if you think about it now, because of the benefits that they pushed in the way of single mothers, have got the single mother vote in their pocket. It keeps them in power. So if a politician can get power through pushing a certain line of action and they simply keep power, because that's all it's about, then they're doing it, and that's why we are as we are.
Do you think that women are subjugated in society?
To some extent, they're subjugated. Usually by other women, though. With the women at work, as I say, it's a female-dominated workplace, and the women at work, so I've talked to some of them, and they're very young, and as they get older, there is an issue that other women put on them about starting a family and having children, and so it goes either way. They can either start a family, but it means they can't work. If they're working, it means that they're cold, career-orientated women, and they can't start, and they don't want to start a family. So they get hit on both sides. But the people doing the hitting are other women. I've never seen a man come up with the kind of, why are you becoming a housewife? You could be going further in your career. You're selling out. No man's ever said that to a woman.
I think the opportunities need to be there for them, but I think they need to be left to their own devices. And if, like, as in case of my daughter, when she had her first child, all of her friends, well, you're going back to work, are you? And she said, well, no, I'm going to stay at home and look after them. Oh, you've got to go out. So it's that peer pressure was there to make her go back to work, and it shouldn't be there.
The grasping, greedy and infantile nature of women, their almost infinite self-interest, and their genuine belief in their moral superiority over men has ensured that feminism is a roaring success, to the detriment of us all.